country, we still never too late. And today, in our own time, in our own country, we still hear versions of the same message. Go back to where you came from. Different century, different vocabulary, same wound. The language changes, the platforms change, the institutions change, but the impulse remains to decide who belongs, who is suspect, who is fully human, and who is merely tolerated. That is why we are here tonight. This event is the first follow-up to the launch of Reclaiming Democracy Together, which took place on Saturday, 9th of May, 2026, at Melbourne Town Hall. More than 1,700 people gathered in person, with more joining online on the 125th anniversary of the opening of Australia's first federal parliament. That launch brought together scholars, activists, artists, educators, community leaders, and members of the public for a day of reflection, storytelling, music, discussion, and democracy dialogue. It explored some of the defining challenges of our time: democratic decline, polarization, climate change, inequality, media power, war, and geopolitics. Also, importantly, indigenous justice, human rights, civic disengagement, and the future of a collective life. So this is not a one-off conversation. It is a part of a longer 7-year civic project. And tonight we continue that work. Now, before we continue, Ahmed, where are you? Ahmed would like to quickly talk about the next event in the series, and then we will continue with our topic for today.
Hi, hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Ahmed. I am a facilitator. I work in the mental health space. I want to take this opportunity to invite you to an event that I'm organizing with Conversation the Crossroads. So it's approaching peace and conflict through a global South lens that aims to decipher what peace means from a decolonial perspective, mainly because peace is highly institutionalized and people's own voices are often neglected from what peace actually means. So this tends to reconstruct that by engaging people from the community. It has a particular focus on 3 main countries that has been impacted by violence. So we have got a speaker from each of these countries. So we have got Mursal, who is from Afghanistan, and she's plays soccer with the women's national team. Also a refugee from Afghanistan. We have got Santino from South Sudan, and he'll be talking about conflict and refugee resettlement in the African context, very experienced. And we've also got Yusuf from Palestine, which is it's a very pertinent issue in the current global affairs. So the main questions is how community-led approaches can help solve conflict, but also what peace means to them. So if this is of interest to you, the event is going to be on the 23rd of July from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Pilgrim College. And the link to register is already out. It's on Conversation the Crossroads website. If you have any questions, I'll be here. You can come and talk to me. Otherwise, feel free to register. We would love to see you there. Thank you.
I'm definitely attending that one. Let's get our focus back to tonight. Tonight, our focus is on a question that is becoming more urgent across the Western world. What is happening to democracy? And why is the far right gaining ground? We are living through a period in which populism, extremism, xenophobia, conspiracy thinking, institutional mistrust, and cultural backlash are no longer fringe concerns. Far-right movements are gaining unprecedented levels of support in parts of Europe, and we are also seeing similar currents emerging in Australia. So tonight we ask, how do we make sense of this moment? What are the economic, cultural, media, technological, and political factors driving it? Are our democratic institutions strong enough to respond? And perhaps more importantly, how should we respond without becoming what we oppose? We are very fortunate to have two outstanding speakers with us tonight. One of our panelists is online, who will speak second. Our panelist who will go first is right here with us. We have with us Associate Professor Mario Peucker. Mario is a Principal Research Fellow at the Institute of Sustainable Industries and Livable Cities at Victoria University. He has researched the radical right and other political groups since 2003, and is also the author of several books, most recently, Democracy Strikes Back, Understanding the Countering and the Rise of the Far Right. Mario brings long-standing scholarly expertise on radical right movements, extremism, democratic resilience, and social conditions that allow these movements to grow. Please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Mario Peucker.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's an honor, and I'm quite excited to talk to you. You asked the big questions. Before I go into this or start addressing some of them, I would also like to acknowledge that we are on unceded land and pay my respect to the owners, traditional owners and custodians of the land. And if there are anyone First Nations people in the room, then let's also visit them too. Okay, so I didn't have this, don't have this on my script, but when you mentioned that this first event was to go closer to them. The first event was to celebrate the first sitting of the parliament. It reminded me that our first prime minister said, Barton said, democracy was never meant to be extended to black and yellow. So he said the very nature of democracy is to exclude them. So this is something to keep in mind, that we are celebrating something that is worth celebrating, but also there's elements that are certainly to be tackled somehow. You mentioned the decline of democracy, as the title of today is a global phenomenon, a global issue. So we want to just put it into that context that Australia is obviously not the only country, and the threats are not only from the far right. So before I come to the far right, we have, you all know this, there are something that you could call an authoritarian turn in quite established democracies, beacon of democracies, you know what I'm talking about, but there are many other places in the world. It doesn't have to be this way, so that it can be reversed. We saw what happened in Hungary, for example, earlier this year. And the threats are not only this authoritarian turn, but they are also in countries like, and established democracies like Australia. Australia is not immune to that. We've seen tendencies where civil liberties have been curbed, how the protest movements have been criminalized. So we see that the risk.
Can you hear him? Might be too soft, sort of.
Right. So we see that also in Australia. So if there's no one, so we can't just point fingers. We also have to say ourselves. So the far right. I'm sure that you all have different.
I know how we can improve it.
Ideologies in your head, and when I mentioned the far right,
Off.
How's yours on?
No, I'm talking to myself.
I like to say sort of interactive, but maybe I just keep, or maybe I see closer.
No, that's the one.
Yeah, sorry. So we have different organizations, different groups, different ideologies in our head. Some people might think about one nation, not surprisingly, others might think about a neo-Nazi organization. These are all far right. I still think the umbrella term of far right is useful, but we should not forget that we are talking about quite a broad range of spectrums in terms of ideology, but also in terms of how their organizational formation looks like, from little cells to a political party to online communities that hang out and find themselves. So I think that's something to keep in mind. The re-emergence of the far right is something that I would date to the mid-2010s roughly. I just mentioned a few things that I think created a perfect storm and keeps doing this. So it's not something that happened once and now we are dealing with the consequences, but it's an ongoing process. We had the aftermath of the economic crisis. I'm not a fan of blaming always the economy. I think that's dangerous to do that, but there was a context factor that certainly played a role. In Europe, we had the immigration, refugee. I don't want to do can you see the quotation about the crisis? Large numbers that contributed. There was some sort of cultural fears included in that. In Australia, we didn't have that, but we had the anti-Islam moral panic around ISIS on the front page every second day or even more. So this cultural threat panic was there as well. Slightly or a bit after that, we could say, I think you mentioned the term backlash itself. A backlash against progressive movements. We saw the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw gender equality and gender diversity, same-sex marriage. There was a lot happening, and it looked like we were on quite a sort of a social justice, racial justice, progressive path. But with that always comes, sadly, sort of a backlash against where people feel like something is taken away from them. This ominous zero-sum idea is something that sits in many heads. And it seems like if they gain, I must obviously lose out. All this within a context of deeply and deepening mistrust in government, in institutions, conspiratorially fueled in many ways. The pandemic played a big role in this as well. So all of this came together. And on top of all this, we have social media. Right? I mean, I'm not a social media expert, but social media is obviously a place where this can be fueled. Where there is a space that can be where people find each other, regardless of what the ideological mindset is. So that was sort of the context. Then the second, just trying to set the scene a little bit with these comments. The second part of what I wanted to share is, on the one hand, talking about why I think that Australia, but also many other democracies, have a relatively weak defense. So that's the first part. I'm saying a few words about this, and then what makes the rise of the far right linked to increasing susceptibilities, vulnerabilities. I think there's a broad pool of people in Western global North societies that are susceptible to the appeal of far right groups in different ways. So I'll come into this in a moment. But first of all, the weak defense. What I mean by that. I think that our commitment to defending democratic processes and norms is not particularly powerful. Maybe it is in this room, I hope it is, but it is not something that people often care a lot about. I read something really interesting by an American political scientist called Gelston. He talks about the liberal democratic bargain. It's an implicit bargain. He says that how democracy usually works, well, there are some people who are really committed to democracies. That's fair enough. No one is taking this away. But what is more common is that people don't actually care about democracy as long as democracy delivers. Democracy delivers security, safety, social mobility, prosperity. As long as I feel safe and all these things are covered, then I think that that's sort of the position. Then the government has done his job. Then I surrender my sort of sovereignty and I basically shut up. I do what's needed. I vote, but I don't make a big fuss. I accept the government of the day. But once the prosperity, the social mobility, the security and safety starts dropping away, people say, hold on, that's not the bargain. You're not living up to your side of the bargain. Why do I have to do anything? I'm not bound by this bargain anymore, and then it collapses. So Gelston says most people know democracy as by the fruit of the tree, not the tree itself, but by the fruit it produces. And once it stops producing the fruit, the prosperity, the safety, the security, the gloves are off. There's no deeper commitment to those democratic principles. And I find that quite fitting, but also a bit scary, to be honest, that this might be the case. He wrote this in 2017, so after Trump won the first election first time. I think this applies to Australia as well. I think it applies to all Western democracies to different degrees. But Australia is relatively good in terms of its institutional, structural defense of democracy. We have a good constitution in that sense. We have compulsory voting. There are lots of institutional pillars that make the democracy in Australia quite stable and less, well, in a way strong. But what we don't have in Australia is a normative, constitutionally enshrined foundation of what democracy really stands for. I mean, you would know that the only civil rights that is really constitutionally enshrined is religious freedom. Everything else is sort of, we don't have a Bill of Rights, one of the, maybe now the only Commonwealth country that doesn't have a Bill of Rights. And we have the Bill of Rights in some states, like Victoria, for example, ACT, Queensland, but there is no culture, no discursive culture how to use those Bill of Rights. Even the UK has had a Bill of Rights now for, what is it, 15, 20 years, but even there is no deep-seated culture of referring to that. So the normative basis is really weak, and that makes it so difficult to respond to threats to democracy, because we can't, as long as our institutions are intact, there's not much we can really refer to. And that's why it's so hard to speak out against treatment of refugees, because maybe I'm just leaning forward instead of. Okay, thank you. It scares me now again. So there is no normative foundation on which, at least constitutionally enshrined, that is stable, that can give us the tools to say, hold on, this kind of treatment is breaching human rights. This kind of treatment is breaching civil rights. The protest laws that I mentioned, anti-protest laws, is showing us how you ban a phrase in Queensland. There's not much really to push back against, although they even have a Bill of Rights. So that's what makes it so difficult. And when we get, I think that's also really important when it comes to the far right, because in Australia, we don't really know how to assess the problem of the far right. We hardly ever talk about the threat to democracy. The discussion around the far right is dominated by security agencies and law enforcement. It's a very securitized approach. ASIO defines basically what it is. So that already tells us that there's a strong securitization lens. And the far right is a problem when it comes to violence. That's the general idea. It's not a problem when it undermines democratic values, because we don't have really the tools to assess that. And that's where we are at the moment in Australia, and where other countries are probably a bit different. I mean, you can tell that I'm German accent. Germany has a very different constitution and a different approach to defining the threat of the far right, which is based on, is it a threat to the constitution, which is the German Bill of Rights in a way. Quite different here. So the problem is, if we focus on violence, first of all, violence is a blurry term. Inciting violence, committing violence, endorsing violence, where do we really draw the line? It's a tricky, lots of gray area, more gray, and I'm not opposed to gray areas, but in this case, it's really difficult to have not a clear-cut definition of what we really are worried about. But it also puts the far-right extremism in a little box, we compartmentalize it, and we don't have to deal with it, because it's those crazy fringe people that do crazy stuff. And that sanitizes the center. We think that we are good. We are the good, democratically minded people in the center. We're the good guys. And those evildoers, those crazy fringe people, they are over there. And that creates a them and us that drives people further into those circles. And it really takes the tools away to look at the problem where it really sits. Because my argument is, and that's, I would say, quite empirically quite solid, that the problem, the susceptibility, the vulnerability to far-right narratives and recruitment is way bigger than we think. It's not just on the fringes, it sits really in the center of our society. And that's where how much time do we have? 5 minutes?
No,
5 minutes, okay. So my key argument is the reason why we haven't made much progress in addressing and countering far-right extremist groups is because we look at the wrong places. We only look at the fringes and then point fingers when it happens over there. Instead of looking at ourselves, we look into the mirror, but it's uncomfortable because we would have to confront what Barton said 125 years ago. We would to confront that our society was built, the national identity is built on a foundation that is not particularly democratic in many ways. So it is an idea of terra nullius, it's an idea of white supremacy, it's an idea of white nationalism. It is, I'm not saying that Australia is defined by this now, but there's a thread in the center of our society. And I think this is uncomfortable, but I'm German, I learned about the Holocaust more than, and I never felt like this was pulling me down. I always thought this was an opportunity to learn. So I think this discomfort is not a negative thing, it's just a learning opportunity. So ideologies that are typically defined as sort of, or seen as what defines the far right: authoritarianism, anti-democratic, white nationalism, racism. If we use that as a definition of the far right, then 25% of Australians would be far right extremists, which isn't there's something not quite right. So I'm not saying that everyone who is racist and authoritarian is automatically deserves the label far right extremism. I'm not arguing that at all. But if we have those attitudes, and about 4 million, according to the surveys, 4 million people in Australia think that democracy is not the best political system. And I think that we need a strong political leader who doesn't have to deal with elections. And this is not a fringe of society. These are millions of people in society that think that way. And that's just like, this is a representative service that we have. So if we ignore that the susceptibility is in the center, then we can't address it properly. So that's my key argument there. Not everyone is a far-right extremist who holds those views, but you could say that the susceptibility is higher, or the willingness to push back when you see sort of white nationalist arguments, racist arguments is smaller if you hold those views yourself in some ways. So that's the first point. Ideologies are widespread across the society more than we think. The second point is grievances. Grievances is something that has been sort of the number one reason what pushes people into extremist groups is grievances, which is, I think, a bit obvious. I mean, of course, there must be grievances, but we all have grievances, or most of us have grievances. So what drives people to have grievances? Drive us to do something, to be angry, to take action, the urgency in something. But why do we have to go down one track and not the other? Why don't we stand up against the injustices that we see and do something about it? Scholars have called this the new term is public anger, but it can turn into moral outrage, which is energizing and positive, or into tribal rage. And if it's tribal rage, then it's connected with this scapegoating. We point fingers at a different group. We don't fix the problem, but it might make us feel better because we feel like we're in a group where we feel some solidarity in that movement that we define. So grievances are crucial: a sense of injustice, a sense of I don't deserve this. My kids deserve better than this. I work hard. Why am I not better off than the generation before? There are lots of reasons why people have social, sort of this sense of social injustices. Men might have it when they are confronted with gender diversity or gender equality frameworks. White people might have it because there's the Black Lives Matter that raises that flag and pushes that agenda of racial justice. But there are lots of different reasons. Economic factors play certainly a role, but it is not the economic status itself. It is what it does to our sense of justice. So I deserve more than this. So someone called it nostalgic deprivation. I compare my status today and say, hold on, I should actually be up there. I should not struggle like this. Someone else must be blamed for this. So that's sort of the grievances element. And the last point, a very common sort of theoretical explanation of extremism, or vulnerability to extremism, is what's called the quest for significance. And what I really like about this is that we all have the need to be someone, to matter, to be significant in a way, to find meaning and purpose in our life, to have social recognition, sense of belonging. We all have that. But there is well, I'm arguing, and I think that I'm right, maybe you challenge me on this, but I think that our society is offering less spaces where we find that social recognition than the respect than it used to. We see the loneliness epidemic. People don't hang out anymore. They sit at home in front of the computer or wherever they are. So there is empirical evidence that people have less social interaction, less contact, less opportunity to feel that form of social worth and recognition. We have, in my research, when I spoke to people from the outer suburbs, where people they say they spend the whole day basically in the car. They leave the house in the morning at 6, spend 2.5 hours in traffic, and thinking about the western suburbs, but it's the same in the southeast or the northern. They have no time to come home. There's no chance to do anything. They drive into the garages and walk from there, not even walking around. They walk straight into their hallway and into their house. There is no interaction, there's no engagement, there's no opportunity they're exhausted. Someone said that this one particular suburb has the highest fish and chips rate in Australia. I'm not sure whether it's true, but because people don't have time to even cook anymore. It's just about surviving somehow, living, the crisis, the living cost of living crisis contributes to the urge to deliver and to bring in money. There's not much space for finding recognition, and volunteering rates are down. This is all terrible. It looks all terrible, but there's something also positive, and then I end with this. The positive thing is that we can change that. We can invest in volunteering. We can invest in urban infrastructure that brings communities together. The local soccer club, the community sports. There's so much we can build for, especially for younger people, but it applies to everyone, to address that kind of lack of meaning that people often have in their lives. Because far-right extremist groups are really good at tapping into this and offering something that is lacking out there. And I close with one statement from a white supremacist who has left a white nationalist movement in Sweden and he said, I joined not because I cared about white supremacy or racism. It could have been the local skateboard club. It just needed someone to hang out with. And I sort of pointed with and said, well, where are our skateboard clubs? Where are those infrastructures that would give people the chance to find those connections in the community? And I hope we have a chance to talk about this a lot more with Lenore and others in the following. So I leave it at that. I know it's staring at it. I mean, I have to really get off here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Mario. You not only gave us a lot of questions to think about, but also some solutions at the end. So that was very nice. And I like that quote about fruit on the tree. Yeah, recently the fruits I've been eating haven't been very tasty. So thank you for that talk. Our next speaker is joining us from Sydney. They're online. Can we see that there on the screen? We'll look at the smart board, everyone. They'll be visible on the smart board. So we are very fortunate to have a second outstanding speaker as well. She is Lenore Taylor. Lenore is a highly respected journalist and a media leader. She was editor of The Guardian Australia for the last 10 years, is a two-time Walkley Award winner and a two-time recipient of the Paul Linham Award for Excellence in Press Gallery Journalism, and was named Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery Journalist of the Year in 2007 and 2014. Lenore brings deep insight into political journalism, media power, public trust, democratic accountability, and the changing relationship between citizens, institutions, and information. Please join me in welcoming Lenore Taylor.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me properly? We didn't do a sound check, so I just want to check that you can hear me. No? Yes? Fantastic. Okay, so I have been doing quite a lot of reading lately about far-right populist parties, Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Nigel Farage, and Pauline Hanson. And so my remarks are going to look at far-right populism in that context. I think, as you all know, Australia came quite late to the far-right populist surge. And one good thing about that, maybe the only good thing about that, is that it means that we've got a lot to learn from elsewhere. As things stand right now, and you may know these statistics, but we are one of just 30 countries in the world, so 7% of the world's population, that still live in full liberal democracies. That's according to a social science outfit called VDEM. If you add in electoral democracy, so people that still have free elections but don't have all the checks and balances and properly robust democratic institutions, that rises to 26%, which you'd have to say is still not terrific. And among the VDEM people say they've never seen so many countries around the world autocratizing at the same time. Now, obviously, as Mario said, there's some countries that are moving away from autocracy as well. But, you know, the global picture is pretty bleak and does give us things to learn from. I have to admit that I was one of those people who actually did think that maybe the surge of populism, this wave of populism, might bypass Australia, in part because we still had some sort of social safety net, because inequality here wasn't quite as dire as in some other countries. The minimum wage was comparatively slightly higher. And also that we had compulsory and preferential voting. We had institutions that helped mitigate against the extremes. Actually, what happened after COVID was that the cost of living crisis, that, you know, when prices were exceeding wages for several years at a time, was layered on top of quite severe income and wealth inequality, which was layered on top of the housing crisis, which really is such a fundamental disruptor to people's lives and ways of life. And I think those things cumulatively pushed Australia to the breaking point that other countries had reached much sooner. And everything I've read suggests that it is that sort of cumulative financial stress over time that really is the sort of breeding ground for a populist message to take root, where people feel like the system isn't delivering what they want, to Mario's point about the liberal democratic bargain, and it hasn't been for a long time, and they have no way of changing it. And so they go for they're attracted to this sort of populist solution, which is a simple solution to divert from those the causes of that economic stress to narratives of blaming immigrants, blaming woke liberals, blaming bureaucrats or international organizations. And what it's offering them often is a sort of a movement, agency, the idea that they join this cause and then they will be able to change something. Now, it's false hope in my view, but it's hope that is being offered by the populist. I think it's really interesting to think about how long Pauline Hanson has been waiting in the wings. You know, I watched her first maiden speech in 1996, and it's really interesting to remember where that was in historical context. Like, it was the Tea Party hadn't been formed yet, I don't think. Donald Trump was still a real estate developer. Nigel Farage was founding the UK Independence Party at the very start of that whole crusade to remove Britain from the UK from the European Union. I don't think Fidesz had won even for the first time in Hungary. So I think in part her One Nation's ascent in the polls in Australia is because the Times have suit their policies. I think events helped them in some ways as well. So the coalition was really falling apart after the election, and there was a real collapse on the Conservative side of politics. The defection of Barnaby Joyce meant that some voters looked at her party again. I think she made a lot of political capital out of the horrific Bondi massacre, linked it to her anti-Islam messaging. And she's got a huge and as yet undocumented source of income from Gina Rinehart and other some wealthy benefactors, and also the connections and the learning and the lessons from the populist right around the world. I think there was a very noticeable sort of spike in her popularity before the Barnaby Joyce defection and before Bondi. It happened soon after she went to Mar-a-Lago with Gina Rinehart to give a speech at the Conservative CPAC conference, where she heaped praise on President Trump for turning America around and deporting illegal immigrants and supercharging fossil fuel mining and other things. One Nation was already at that time quite good at political communication in this new social media age, where the arteries of communication are very much optimize a populist message. They're optimized for simple slogans and emotive messaging, messaging of anger and messaging of entertainment. I think Ed Koper, if you haven't read it, has recently written a book called Angertainment, which is a very good explanation of how the new mechanisms of information are really suited to right-wing populist messaging. I don't know if any of you have looked at Pauline Hanson's animations, the cartoons that she does. They're quite well done. They're quite funny to her supporters. And the thing that they really let her do is say the quiet bits out loud, the things that are certainly, to my view, destructive for democracy, and that she doesn't quite dare say yet. So, for example, her stated policy is that she wants to abolish SBS and she wants to make the ABC a subscription model in the cities. She says not in the rural areas, because obviously rural communities are very reliant on the ABC. The cartoon, the animation, though, has a long and involved story where Anthony Albanese goes to see Kim Williams because the culture is changing and everyone's turning against him. And the ABC is painted as being overfunded and hopelessly biased and all the rest of it. The point of telling this story is that at the end of the animation, Kim Williams is booted out the front door of the ABC and it says closed out of business. So the animation is the wink to her supporters that that's what she really means. She really wants to get rid of the ABC and SBS, which I think, most people would agree would be very detrimental to Australia's media environment. And I don't think she dares quite say out loud yet as a policy, because the ABC remains trusted and popular. Anyway, so getting back to the surge late last year, before Bondi, before Barnaby, and just after Mar-a-Lago, I've been wondering about it a lot, and I wondered about it a lot more after a story that The Guardian ran over the weekend, which found that some of the largest One Nation supporter groups on Facebook, where she gets a lot of traction, and on YouTube, were very recently formed and were run from overseas by foreign digital creators who monetize content, predominantly from Indonesia. They're sort of like for-hire engagement farms. The people who engage with that content are real Australians who are influenced by it, but the people making it are doing it for a profit elsewhere. Now, what the story didn't say and couldn't prove is whether those engagement farms are just doing it for the money that they earn from Meta, which may be the case, or whether they were being paid by third parties. I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that something is happening in the way that she is turbocharging her already very effective online communication. And I think that has at least something to do with her surge in popularity. I think that leads to a longer conversation about the role of the media, which we might not have time for tonight. I mean, I've spent my life as a political journalist and a commentator and an editor. I think the role of the media in holding politicians to account is more important than ever. But I think we have to be realistic that most people under 45 probably now get their news in a completely disaggregated way on social media. I think that's a challenge for the mainstream media to hold on to their accountability role. And I think there's a transformation going on where new sources of information are springing up, and a lot of them are doing good work. But a lot of it is opinion and analysis, and not a lot of it is investigations and accountability. I think there's going to be a growing gap in the market there, which is relevant to the idea of democratic accountability. I think there's an open debate actually about whether we even have a public square anymore. I think the other thing voters are rejecting at the moment is how politics has been practiced, the influence of money in the system, but also the way it has for a long time seemed kind of, I don't know, bloodless, so timid, so lacking in passion, and above all, kind of lacking in hope, which really I think is essentially what a far-right political party offers. False hope, in my view, but hope. Pauline Hans's offers people hope that something can change. And I think that's really where far-right populists have been winning, and winning all around the world, in a battle of storytelling. They tell stories that are passionate and entertaining and funny and irreverent, and all of that makes them work much better on social media than the mainstream parties. But above all else, it gives their supporters hope and agency and a feeling of being part of a movement for change. And I feel like often the response from mainstream parties has been to underestimate the far-right parties, to think that they're clowns and they're really not serious because their policies are not well costed or well thought through often, and to be sort of technocratic about it. You know, they don't call them political machines for no reason. They offer a list of policies. If you vote for us, then, you know, you're going to get after-hours medical centres and tax cuts, and here's the table, and look, you'll get $6.73 a week. But there's not really a narrative binding it together or an uplifting, hopeful story behind it. And I think the major parties are starting to understand that, but it's not something that they're as good at. I think the other, so really to beat that story of blame and of othering people, you need a better story. You need a better inclusive story that promises bigger changes that than the ones that are on the table at the moment, bolder change. And I think the major parties are starting to understand that too. I think, you know, Labor brought out the CGT changes in the budget, which, you know, got caught up in a fair bit of disagreement, but it's at least some structural change to the housing market. The coalition promised to index income tax thresholds. But I think people are looking for bigger reforms, bigger changes, maybe to the tax system so there's more money for services, or maybe to competition rules because the anti-competitiveness in the economy is one big reason we pay higher prices, or to regulations. I don't think it's really red tape and a bad thing to have proper safeguards for the environment or for people who are vulnerable and getting services in aged care or childcare. Red tape's sort of just what business calls it. It's not my job to write a manifesto for political parties, but my point is that I think they are seeing that to get through to voters and to give voters what they want, they need to be much, much bolder, much less beholden to the sort of big money and big business that have muted their sort of aspirations in the past. I think they're getting it. I'm not sure they yet really know how to do it. And then I guess there's the way that you tell the story. And I think we've come from a time when politicians often sort of spoke in quite focus group tested sound bites. And I don't think that works anymore. And I think if you think about how maybe left-wing populists like Bernie Sanders or Zoran Mamdani or AOC talk, or you think about how Nigel Farage talks, or even Donald Trump, who they don't sound scripted, they sound authentic. I mean, Donald Trump sounds kind of unhinged to me at times, but he sounds authentic to his supporters. And I think if you think about how they talk, and then you think about how Anthony Albanese or Angus Taylor talks, you can see why, particularly in an era when people are getting their information in little short grabs, the former works better than the latter. The final point I want to make is the need for civil society and mainstream parties to adapt to these circumstances and think about the threat to liberal democracy posed by parties like One Nation and also by the mainstreaming of their ideas into the political system more generally. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, One Nation's about 29% in the poll. So, you know, that means there's 70% or so of Australians who don't support them. But I think underestimating their influence would be a mistake for 4 reasons. One is their ideas have already been normalized and mainstreamed slowly over the last 30 years. You know, that maiden speech was really transgressive at the time. I don't think it would really shock anyone much anymore. And that normalization has really gained pace more recently. If you look at how the coalition is adapting or changing its immigration policies, its climate policies to appear, you know, to sort of move towards the One Nation way of seeing the world. I think the other reasons are that the pressure, the disillusionment and the anger that the electorate is feeling that's finding voice in One Nation will still be there if One Nation, you know, succeeds or fails, and it will find an outlet somewhere, and it will be a threat unless those concerns are better addressed. I think if far-right parties gain power, all the evidence around the world is that they do dismantle essential elements of liberal democracy. That's what happened in that VDEM study that I described at the start. I think One Nation's policies at the moment are, you wouldn't really describe them as well-formed, so it's hard to clearly define what they would do. There's no Project 2025 to sort of look at it in clarity. But, you know, there's obvious trends there in terms of the overt othering of migrants and lack of respect for every human being having equal worth and dignity. The idea of a free and independent media is clearly not high on her agenda. The idea of a expert bureaucracy and civil service is not high on her agenda. Her views on parental leave and childcare and abortion would raise real questions about what One Nation in power, with any sort of power, would mean for women's participation in democratic life. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons to be aware and be vigilant about that. And I think the 4th reason really is that we're entering a period of history where we really, really need a responsive and stable democratic government. The climate crisis is here. The AI revolution is rolling out with whatever consequences that's going to bring. The geopolitical shockwaves from, you know, the populist revolution around the world and what it's doing to the post-world order and institutions. Now more than ever, we need sensible, factual, fact-driven government, and that is democratically responsive. So for all of those reasons, my point really is that whatever happens in the polls to One Nation, it's really the symptom, not the cause. And I think there needs to be a much bolder, louder story in defense of democracy, a much bolder, louder response to the concerns about what democracy is delivering for citizens. And it needs to be told in a much more authentic and social media friendly way, if you like. And I'm not sure who's going to tell it, but I guess in a democracy, ultimately, that falls to all of us.
Thank you for your fantastic talk, Lenore. It was really educative. You spoke about authenticity as well. I remember studying this, teaching this actually in marketing. It's surprisingly not even politics, in marketing 15 years ago, and we said one of the major rising trends is authenticity. And we were, of course, focusing on products, but here we see it's also the way politicians conduct themselves. So such an important point. It's time for Q&A. It's your turn now. So let us take a few questions. Please keep it brief. Please don't make me remember my daughter. She comes to me saying, I have a question, and it ends up being a speech and a statement. So let us keep it to questions only, brief. So let us start with our audiences here. And yes, please, it's your turn. You're up there with your hand up. So we have someone at the back. I may repeat the question if it's not too long. So As well.
I'm a little disappointed we haven't heard more about corporate power. Because in my humble opinion, if you look around the world, it is the multinational corporations and their political allies that are making and breaking governments and politicians. And so now in the United States, we have Elon Musk, who is a trillionaire, the richest person in the world. And so I'd like to hear the panelists address the role of corporate power in undermining democracy, even so-called liberal democracy.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, you can see this show.
You go ahead.
If I'm going to answer that, I agree with you. I think there are two elements to it. There are multinational corporations that are bigger and more powerful than any one government, and mean that and can basically flaunt what any government wants them to do. And we're seeing that in various guises at the moment with the big digital media platforms and the reforms that the government is trying to bring in particular the news bargaining incentive. And even with domestic corporations, I mean, the waves of privatization of essential services means that the privatized service deliverers get the profits, and the government still is blamed if the service isn't delivered or regulated properly. So I think in both instances, voters hold the government responsible for things that are in some respects outside of their gift or outside of their power. And I think that is a fundamental and structural problem. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but if it is, I would agree with you.
We have a question from online from David Week. Why have we failed to hear and address the expressions of disillusionment that seems to be a structural or institutional flaw?
Okay, we'll call it the easy one. There's a book called The Tyranny of Meritocracy, and I think that's a really interesting way to respond to that question. I think there is, and maybe also to the first question where the corporate neoliberal capitalist society wants us to compete against each other and to deliver profit and to be as productive as we can be and good consumer on top of that. So the tyranny of merit, sorry, by Zeno, says that technological changes has led to a polarization and created modernization losers and modernization winners. And they don't really, those who tend to be in power and influential positions tend to be the ones who are the winners. And they look down at the hubris, as Sandro says, to those losers. And the losers look up with whatever it is, hatred, despise. So those who are in a position of power, they have no incentive to change that because they benefit from the system. Whereas those at the bottom, they have incentives, but not the power to change it. So that leads to that kind of a tendency to silence and to look away when concerns arise. We see that, to make it less abstract, the COVID pandemic lockdown protests, and then we just dismissed it. I mean, I have very strong views on that as well. So mental health crisis, I understand all this, and vaccine. But the way it was dismissed was really this hubris, this putting people down. The worst what I heard was this baby Nazi sort of statement. It was just the opposite of acknowledging pain and suffering and the struggles, because we could. Those who were in a position, we could do it. We could just impose, but it backfires, and that's what we have now.
Hi, my name's Peter, and I'd like to thank the panel for their excellent discussion tonight's topic. I'd say I agree with everything that's been discussed. But what also really stood out to me is that we're talking about far right, far left, and the symptoms of, you know, what we see is the outward symptoms of what occurs, you know, under the guise of right or left. But what also we talked about here was, Lenore mentioned agency and the lack of agency and how people seem to get attracted to the far right or left because they feel like they are given a voice. And I'd like to ask about how, rather than maybe labeling people as left, right, or anything else, what the view would be if Australia and other countries maybe gave people more of a voice, gave them more agency, and maybe that is what people are really looking for. And what are your thoughts on that, essentially?
Jamal,
Do you want me?
speak? Tell Lenore to speak.
I mean, I think there's a lot of thought going into various ways that that could happen in, you know, more participatory modes of democracy, citizens' assemblies, referenda, all kinds of measures. And I think, you know, all of those things are worth looking at and thinking about. But at the end of the day, I think people want to Mario's point in his initial presentation, I think a lot of people want democracy to be to listen to their concerns, to deliver them what they want for their lives. And you know, I don't know what proportion of the population would actually want to go to a citizens assembly or want to participate in a much more active way if they were getting in their daily lives the things that they wanted to get from a democratic system, if it was functioning in the way that they wanted it to function. I mean, Mario's probably thought about this a lot more than I have, but I'm just not sure.
I would say that agency is really related to what I said before about the purpose and to be someone, to matter. That's almost like the definition of agency, right? So I think I sort of addressed it, but didn't mention the word agency is the key. If you feel like you have a voice, you can political efficacy, you matter. The theory, the question significance theory would say all the narratives and the networks and all these other factors that might pull you into extremist groups, they don't matter. They don't stand a chance if you have a solid connection in your local community, you go to your local soccer club, you have friends there, you think life is good. You're not going to get sucked into this kind of stuff. There's no need for that. So I think that sort of sense of agency is really the implicit in that sense of purpose and meaning.
Hi, I'd like to thank the panel for a very interesting discussion, and particularly I wanted to. I was very encouraged to hear the stuff that Mario was saying about not dismissing people's concerns and about, you know, looking in the mirror to figure out what the underlying factors are that everyone contributes to. So in that respect, I would be willing to bet that the overwhelming majority of people in this room vote either Labor or Greens at the election. How will you go about engaging people of other political persuasions in the conversation and you know, in advancing democracy?
Can I just make a very quick comment and then hand over to Leonor? I always bring up the pedestrian crossing local community initiative. If you have kids in your school or grandkids in your school and they don't find a safe way to cross the street to their school, you are in the same boat. You have a reason to pull together and to work and to lobby and to advocate and do something in your local group to advocate and to push until you get that safe pedestrian crossing. And the reason I'm saying this is there are so many things that bind us together. There's the common concerns that overlap all those ideologies. I don't care whether the other parent is a One Nation voter or a Greens voter or whatever. We want that our kids go to school safely. And if we invest in that, it's not that it just pops up, those groups. There's infrastructure investment, there's local governments that can support that can provide a space where people can meet, they can encourage that, they can fund it. That's the role that one of the roles that local councils can play. And I think that happens predominantly locally. Instead of staring at the things that divide us, I know that's sort of a bit of a throwaway line, but there's so much more. You know, the climate crisis shouldn't divide us. The climate crisis should not be something that is politicized. And working with farmers, for example, can be an entry into this because they are affected, they know what's going on. So there are lots of things. There's not one clear answer to that, but the principle is to identify the common problems that we all want to address, or at least many of us.
I'm just going to add to that from the comments online as well. Kate has asked, wondering how many in this room and online voted no for the voice. My name's Dr. Melbourne. Funnily enough, I'm actually standing for the state elections as a Liberal. To your point, exactly. And I think what happens is that even with the voice, I'm very close. My first degree was Aboriginal Administration Management, and I'm very close with a lot of Indigenous elders. 6 weeks before the referendum, I asked Uncle Jean Blow, one of the elders up in Stradbroke Island that I do a lot of work with, Uncle, I'm so confused. Am I voting yes or no? And he said to me after a 1 hour lecture, no, because it's the lesser of two evils right now. 2 weeks before the voice referendum, I said to him, Uncle, are you sure? Am I voting yes or no? And after a 1 hour lecture, he turned around and he said, I think we're voting yes. Now, if he, as a educated, works in Queensland Health, up in Queensland, doesn't know 2 weeks beforehand whether we were voting yes or no, unfortunately, politics did that because we didn't know whether we were coming or going. So I don't think you can blame Australia for that, nor Liberal, Labor, Greens, and all the rest of it. Sorry, I had to have my two folks. Other questions?
That's the last question.
Last one?
Last one. Yeah. Okay.
My name's Eric. I find myself confused, and in response to you, I think a lot of other people will be voting teal. Seems to me that what we're facing at the bottom of things is two very conflicting issues. One is we're facing the issue of me, my rights, individualism, what I want, people listening to me. On the other hand, we're facing an increasingly complex society that is harder and harder to draw together to find common feelings, common moods, common policies. And one's drawing people apart, individualism, one's needing to draw people together. The complexity of society, the needs for the planet as a whole. How do we find ways to resolve those two tensions when we in this room probably have a whole lot of different perspectives on those things, let alone the wider range of people across society who maybe often have much more immediate concerns about making ends meet?
No, there's children. We'll add two questions together. We'll let you ask as well together, and then we'll hear everyone.
My question is somewhat similar. The panel didn't touch on the role of disinformation in this. I'm interested to hear what their thoughts are about how do we deal with the fact that there's there's an erosion of a shared understanding of the truth. We no longer have a common truth. We no longer believe the same things.
Over to Lenore.
I can take the second one. And I agree that it is an incredibly difficult part of this equation. It's sort of been my life for the many decades now, trying to keep truth as the guardrails of public debate, and I'm afraid that that hasn't. I mean, I think that's really been eroded. You just have to look at the climate debate now, where in somehow a target necessary to keep the world within, habitable levels of global heating has become some kind of bogeyman and responsible for, economic demise. I mean, the arguments being presented, how do I put this? You could look at the current state of climate science and you could take a whole variety of rational responses to that. But actually, the response that is most prevalent, certainly from One Nation and the populist far right, is to present a sort of straw man argument around a target as an excuse to do absolutely nothing. It's kind of the new form of denial. And that's, to me, just one example of where a debate has completely jumped the shark in terms of facts and jumped any kind of reasonable level of disagreement. And it's a very consequential example. I think it's hugely difficult. And all of the, there's many books and theories about what to do, and civics education and fact checking and whatever else. But ultimately, I think the only solution really lies in the trust between what the person reading the information and the purveyor of the information. So as an editor, it was the trust in our masthead that would make people believe that, what we were telling them was the truth. For a politician, similarly, I think those relationships of trust are the only real way to combat the problem, because I don't think you can fact check your way out of it or censor your way out of it, or the way information is disseminated at the moment is almost perfectly created to disseminate falsehoods and misinformation. So I think trusted relationships is really the only way through it.
Time of comments. I have to say something about the disinformation as well. I'm really concerned about this. Not that misinformation is anything new. We've always had this. But I feel like before the Enlightenment, I'm not going to go big. The definition of truth was religion. So you believe in a way. Then the rationality kicked in, and it was facts claimed that and I feel like we are coming to an end of this era. So this is like, I don't want to be sort of the big sort of predictor, but I feel like this has weakened substantially, this idea that we can actually have a rationality is overrated. You can't win an argument with rationality anymore. It's about emotions, it's about how you want to see that, where you want to look. I'm very concerned. I think that what Lenore said about trust is the key. So it is about something else than just fact checking and providing the right information. If we rely on that, we are lost. I'm sorry to say, and more so, you can come. AI is obviously something that everything is up for grabs in a way. And what the other question, very briefly, the individual and I think this is the living condition, the tension and duality between those, the dichotomy between this. And we always had to deal with that somehow. There was always individualism, there was always communitarianism, there was always society. We will have to figure it out, like everyone has figured it out in the past. I'm a big proponent of sort of looking at local communities, local interactions, where the bridge seems less big, smaller, shorter. Global issues can overwhelm us. We just don't know what to do. It's just too big. I work on racism a lot. It's just, how would you even think about addressing this? It's too. But if we break it down, if we engage with our neighbor, if we talk to our kids, if these are little things that can actually make the impossible all of a sudden quite natural and normal. Like we do that. The local context. I'm a fan of micro utopias. We can create utopias without fixing the big global challenges we can create in our local environment. Little circles, our family, our neighborhood, our suburb, and in expanding those, our workplaces, we can do that by doing that together. So I think this is a hopeful, again, a hopeful thing at the end, isn't it?
Thank you very much. I know you have a question, but I have to move on. Let me think how I can give you a chance to speak later. So hold on to it. What we're going to do next is a small activity for 15 minutes. After that 15 minutes activity, Joe and I will have a conversation with our panelists. So that will be the next one. So for 15 minutes, you could now form small groups and have a chat with each other about today's topic. Any question, it's really up to you. It will be a nice time to just freshen up, talk about it. If something's really pressing inside, talk to the person next to you, or I can give you 2 questions if you want to be guided. It's really up to you. So number 1, you have the freedom, speak whatever, discuss whatever, or my 2 questions are for you if you would like to discuss those as well. Why does housing stress so easily become a conversation about migrants rather than tax policy, planning, wages, intergenerational wealth, and housing supply? So why is that? So maybe you could discuss that if you like. Or there is another question you could chat about as well. Are we focusing too much on extremist violence and not enough on gradual normalization of anti-democratic attitudes? So over to you for 15 minutes at around 7:55. Joe and I will resume with our conversation with the panelists. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's time for analytics. Thank you very much. All right. Time to resume. All right. All right, so we have a few questions. We're going to bring up a few topics. One is from me. It's for both our panelists. It's more to do with internet. So I would like you to explore a bit more about internet, because we spoke about misinformation, and what I feel is a lot of times we are treating internet as just a form of communication, but it's way more. It's actually becoming a venue for a lot of young people to form their identities as well. So I was trying to link how we view internet and what role it has to play with our topic today. Over to you. Over to Mario, you can go. Yeah.
Gave me 5 seconds to think about it. So I should probably start by saying that I acknowledge that social media are part of the problem, but I also think that they can be part of the solution. And I'm not saying that this is the new, that I don't want to demonize social media. Because the risk is that when you make the difference between online and offline, we treat online as if it's a new reality. People sit in front of the computer, they type things, they communicate, they're still people. They still sit in the offline world. So the distinction between online and offline is maybe not as harsh or not as rigid as we may think. So that's the first one. But of course, it gives us, it doesn't only lead to a sort of a democratization as we first all were hoping for, because, and that's where the comments from before come in, because it's monetized. So it's about lots of the spaces online are for making money. And Lenore mentioned the One Nations Indonesia-based troll factory, and that's not obviously not a one-off thing that happens. That's one element. The algorithms reward, try and push people into certain bubbles. That's a very disempowering thing. I tell my son that you are the master of your own algorithm. You define, because if you are good at it, you're not going to get sent this more than 3 times, because then they give up on you. So it has also something empowering in there. But I understand that the front line, the front defense are we, and in my case as a father, my son. Like, all the technological things are really hard to manage. Is part of the answer. That it's part of the solution is that we have strong legislation and all this. But ultimately, it's about the people who use the internet. They are our strongest force. They have to be trained. They have to be support, they have to be made aware of where the risks are and how to play the system so it works for them in a good way. So I know social media is a big thing. I hope can offer a bit more substantial comments on that.
You can't be.
No, she's not online. She's not there. What do you mean?
Now, over to Joe.
Yeah, she's not online.
Well, I'm going to share a few thoughts first, then ask you to respond to others too. And I'm not sure whether Lenore is going to be with us or not, but anyhow, I think both of our guests tonight have offered very substantial insights. But nevertheless, I would like to probe a little more deeply, if I may. I think Lenore said, and I think Mario probably would agree, the rise of the far right is just a symptom. And there are so many other symptoms, unpleasant ones, all around. We have to look at the causes. Why now? Why not 30 years ago? Why now? Is it just the 2008, 2010 financial crisis, really? Really? There is disenchantment, yes. But we have to probe and say, well, what's this disenchantment? It might help. And it's right across the Western world, right? With few exceptions. Why now and why everywhere? Why now? Why not in 20 years from now? Why now? Because things are coming to a head. Maybe in the same way that they started coming to a head in the Europe of the 1920s. And we know what followed. In the 1920s, it still seemed a bit harmless. Even to 1930, with Mussolini already there. Oh, just, no, who cares about Italy and Mussolini? Just a freak accident. And then it was the others, one after the other. And then we know. The reasons were very profound then. It had nothing to do with the rise of Hitler. The rise of Hitler was a symptom of a very deep and profound set of problems unresolved, including the aftermath of World War I. So, to put it very simply, and it would take many, many hours to explain it, which I won't inflict on anyone. The institutions we now have are no longer fit for purpose. Let's call a spade, not an agricultural input. Which institutions are no longer fit for purpose? Virtually all of them. Our political parties are no longer fit for purpose. They were once. When the Labour parties of the world, the Social Democratic, Socialist and all the others, and even the Tories, the Conservative parties, they amounted to something. That some of them had membership of 1 million plus. The parties had their own newspaper, their own media. Millions more than the members were caught in an intense conversation. You can count the members of a branch on the fingers of one hand. What are we talking about? It's a non-existing political formation.
John.
It is a non-existing political formation. I'm not just singling them out. All of the parties, frankly, they don't amount to very much. Now, three ideas and you can hear the noise in the head. They can't cope with more than three profound ideas. They can't. Some of them have trouble putting three sentences together in grammatical fashion. That's the quality of what we have. The structures attract these people. Now, first point. Second point, they don't go. That has already been raised. They go through the pretense of government. They operate within a very, very narrow confine of what they deem to be acceptable within the scheme of things, without having powerful interests bearing upon them and making life for them impossible. As unnamed, a former foreign minister spoke to a number of ministers currently in government, senior ministers, former foreign minister, and he went through them in detail, as he can, about the problems resulting from the AUKUS agreement. In detail. And they listened, they had to listen, because he's an established member of the family. And then almost all of them said to him more or less the same thing. They said, yes, addressing him by his first name, but we don't have to worry about these because all of the things you've mentioned will only happen 6, 7, 8 years from now, and we won't be here to worry about. That actual conversation was made public, and it has never been called into question. And that's the reality. They did to go against the tide in terms of power on that issue and just about every other one. The way we treat coal and gas companies and so on and so on are indicative that power has become less and less visible. They don't govern, but it's imperative that we think that they govern so that the visibility moves away from the real people who have power and wealth. And the point that I think I would like to make is power and wealth have never been as unequal as they are at this time, right across the Western world. In Australia, income inequality and wealth inequality, it's greater than it has been probably for as long as records have been kept. In 2024, the last figures which we have, 2.5 million Australians suffered from food insecurity. They had trouble having one decent meal a day. And at the same time, 200, just under, billionaires earned $94,000 an hour. People may not know these figures precisely, but they feel it. They know it. And the third point I want to make, if we're serious about democracy, we have to go back to the fundamentals of democracy, to those who fashioned the roots of the idea. It has very little to do with election. Very, very little. For some of the greatest democratic thinkers, elections were a mere footnote. What's democracy? It's the people together in charge of everything. In charge of everything. No technology sees the light of day until and unless they have approved of it. At every level, from research to full development and commercialization. Unless the people have decided that they can't happen. Now, of course, Mario made a very important point. Big issues now are getting very, very complex. And therefore, we need to have a substantial number of the population able to discuss complex issues. So when I said institutions are no longer fit for purpose, I include the institution of which I've been part for the better part of 60 years. Educational institutions are not fit for purpose. Are not fit for purpose. Our schools are not fit for purpose. Our universities not fit for purpose because they do not help to produce a new generation that can rise to the challenge of the enormous problems we face locally, nationally, regionally, or globally. Our religious institutions are no longer fit for purpose. Our media institutions are not fit for purpose. So what I'm trying to say is, and they help to create the culture, one where the tendency is to think in individual terms and to think in consumer terms. I'm a consumer, I'm a spectator, I don't have any role in production. Others make the decisions about production and promotion and marketing. I just consume. Little me, what can I do? That's totally contrary to democracy. Democracy is based on an understanding of the common good and a willingness to engage about how the common good applies in this and that question. That's what Greece, ancient Greece, Athens was all about. Admittedly, it was fraught with a number of limitations. It was confined to Athenian citizen males. But the idea that should then be spread to everyone, regardless, was that they made the decision. If someone did not work in line with the decision, they could be dismissed. They would meet in large numbers. They would meet in large numbers. Only 50,000 male citizens it would take, year in, year out. In any one year, 80% would turn up at least to one meeting, 60% to at least 3 meetings, and 20% to the monthly meeting. That's wow. 20% of Australians meeting every month. Wow. But that's the culture. That's democratic culture. If you don't have it, don't pretend it's democracy. It isn't. So we have a long way to go, in my view, to begin to equip people with a real understanding of democracy, a real understanding of the challenges we face, and how democratically we can begin to respond and rise to the challenges. I see that as the critical problem. It's Australia's problem, it's France's problem, it's America's problem. And while they're only 8% of the population or 7% of the population, they have 70 or 80% of the control of what happens, declining with Asia rising, but still coming from a very high level. So we still have a lot of responsibility for what has happened already. The many existential problems we have faced, largely of the making of the Western world, and we have a great responsibility to come to terms. So the democratic issue, as I see it, is one that needs to come to grips with these profound problems and not merely the symptoms. What do we do about Hanson? What we do about Hanson is ask these probing questions and make the conversation national and international as well as local. Hard, but we could sell each other a little. You know, you go to the doctor, oh yes, it's just indigestion. Take that. And you may be suffering from cancer. To be told that it's just indigestion may be uplifting, but not for long. That's my comment.
Don't ask me to. Well, I mean, there were so many things that when we spoke there, but maybe just one thought. Erich Fromm wrote Escape from Freedom in the 50s or 60s. They critical Frankfurt School dealing with the question, how could this have happened, the rise of totalitarianism and mainly Nazism, but then also Stalinism, of course. And this escape from freedom resonates quite a bit with what you're saying. When I quote something from the 50s or 60s, the problems haven't changed that much. It's just that how they manifest are quite different. Once I come back to the Enlightenment, our lives were structured. What Weber calls the disenchantment because of the religious framing of our norms and purpose was falling away. So people still needed sort of enchantment somehow, but they felt disenchanted. So we have the freedom that Fromm talks about the freedom, but we want to escape from that because it's too much. We don't know what to do with it. We consume, that's the capitalist system, we go to work, we do all these things that we distract. We are easy prey for totalitarian narratives and messaging. That's the, in a way, what you're, if I interpret that correctly, all the ills of modern capitalist, these are all sort of loaded terms. Modernity, maybe not quite as loaded. They are still the same. There's nothing new. We don't know what to do with our freedoms. That we can actually, we don't have to believe in a God. We can go out and achieve something, and we can, but we don't know what to do with it. We feel not certain, and that's why we get into consumerism and all these other things that has been discussed for for 80 years now, and in the context of the rise of totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt spoke about this information when she said, well, it's like Steve Benton's version of flooding the space with shit. That's what he said. You just have to spread all these falsehoods, not to convince someone that you're right, but to confuse people enough to not know anymore what's right. So it's not relevant to them. And then you're easy prey. These are all things that have been around for many, many decades. For me, the question is, why did we have such a rather prosperous time in the 60s, 70s, and maybe the 80s? And then it feels like it's falling apart again. So maybe turning the question around a little bit, what happened during that time? As I said, I'm not a big fan of, it's the economy stupid sort of thing. I think economic wealth, prosperity is the best distractor that we have. It keeps people quiet. And that's, again, the liberal democratic bargain. As long as you make sure that I'm safe from external threats, from internal threats, and you make sure that I'm fine, it's fine. And if not, then it's not fine anymore. And that's what I don't want to draw too sort of serious and direct parallels between the 1920s and 30s and the early 2000s and now. But the collective socioeconomic suffering is one parallel. The sense of loss and not knowing that the sense of the loss of certainty is something that we have. Now we have the social media on top of this to come back to that. So there are lots of parallels, but history doesn't repeat itself, and we just go and then what did go wrong in the 20s and 30s, and we fix it this time. But there are signs that we should think about, and this is what you mentioned are really important considerations. I don't know what, I'm not a big picture thinker. I like going sort of deep, local, like interaction. So the big systemic things, then there's a strong argument that in our current late capitalist society, there's a lot of social alienation. We don't connect, we don't really know what's going on. That's sounds like a new diagnosis, but it's not at all.
But I think there is a different element, if I may. Things need to happen locally. But what you need to do is to bring the world local. You need to understand what you can do in relation to climate change, which is a global phenomenon. You need to understand about refugees. You need to know that within 15 to 20 years, there will be up to 1 million South Pacific Islanders wanting refuge in Australia, and there is no way to stop. Now it will happen. It will happen. It cannot be stopped. Are we ready for that? Can you imagine 1 million people over a period of time, not in 1 week, banging on the door? That's what Europe is experiencing right now for different reasons. So you've got to look at it, I'm afraid, the big picture. You have to look at the big picture. Look at it. How many displaced people are there now? 125 to 130 million. They've got to go somewhere. Where will they go except to the west? Will they go to Kazakhstan? Will they go to Russia? Will they go to China? They're going to come to the places which invaded them 200 to 300 years ago, because they know them. They know them. They can speak French, they can speak English, they can speak Spanish. They know European languages. They don't know Chinese by and large. They don't know Japanese. They have connections to France, to Spain, to Italy, to Britain, etc., to Australia. And so that's where they'll come. And we are wondering why they're coming here. They're coming here for a very simple reason. We invaded them. And they said, well, we can invade back. That's what's happening. In a different way, without use of force and so on. But that's just one. Climate change. Spiraling arms race. Trump wants $1.5 trillion for this coming year's annual defense budget. 1.5 trillion. Of course it will be matched by others. And that's a local question. It affects housing. It affects the budget. You can't separate that question from the local issues. The local issues are invariably those affected by the big issues. So there is no option but to think about the big issues as responsible citizens. The problem we have is that we are no longer citizens of just our community, our municipality, the state of Victoria or Australia. We have to be citizens of the world. And the question is, for me, how can we democratize the globe as well as individual countries, as well as localities in tandem? You can't have democracy in one country anymore. Maybe you never could. You can't have democracy in one country because so many issues are interconnected. Climate change can't be dealt with in Australia. We can make a contribution, but we can't resolve climate change. We can't resolve the spiraling arms race. We can't resolve so many things. They have to be achieved by democratic decision-making that goes beyond the local or the national, but includes the local.
Thank you very much. We have two comments, one which I held before and one from you.
Thanks, Joan. I think the real question here is that we're all wondering maybe is how are we going to even just start having a conversation where we get 20% of Australians even talking about democracy in the first place? Isn't that the first problem before we deal with the whole world?
Oh, yeah. Part of what? Oh, look, of course it is. You're not going to get 20% tomorrow. As of now, on back of the envelope calculation, we stand at about 1%, give or take. It'd be nice to get to 5% within the next 5 to 6 to 7 years. And within 20, perhaps we can reach the 20%. But you'd have to have a lot of people willing to put time, energy, and money amongst the 1% in order to increase it. And that's what the project, the initiative that we launched on the 9th of May. To establish a framework where more and more people are willing to come to the public square, wherever they happen to be, online and in person, some combination, in 101 different ways, and discuss the issues of common interest. It will take some doing, but we can make a start.
Last commenter, thanks.
One very quick comment. I don't think there is a lack of commitment necessarily. When I look at Friday for Future, the young people want to be out there. They did stand up. They do go to protests, but the space, but it was demonized. It was pushed back. The government didn't. The government did the opposite of what they're supposed to do to facilitate and encourage that. They did the opposite. Kids should be at school. Protests have been criminalized. The opposite of doing democracy instead of. As important as the talking about it is as well, but democracy is saved by doing it, not whether you know all your stuff or not. You have to do it. Go out there and make your voice heard. Get a sense of political efficacy. Do things the unusual way, whatever it takes. I think there's so much energy that we underestimate our young people, but the government is not facilitating them, and that's their role. This is what they need to do way more instead of going into the opposite direction.
The billionaire venture capitalist Peter Thiel said the quiet bit out loud in an interview when he said, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." With the pervasiveness of neoliberalism, what's to be said about the idea that extreme capitalism and democratic governance are structurally at odds?
Structural question.
Okay, look, this is a very large question. We didn't get around to talking about this, but there is a factor in, quote, liberal democracies that has got us to where we are now, and it's basically the rise of neoliberalism. The first 30 years were free of neoliberalism, first 4 years, the first 3, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, just to generalize. It's full of neoliberalism. It's a shorthand for a complex set of ideas. And that's contrary to the democratic idea, and the gap has been increasing. And the disenchantment that results and the mistrust that results then provides fertile ground for the kinds of weeds we have been discussing, this cultural weeds that we've been discussing. But it's the soil. The soil has been turned upside down and destroyed. And in that soil, weeds are tends to grow. That's the reality. We have to do some reconstructing of the soil to retrieve some of its fertility. And then perhaps weeds will have not such good day.
The problem is that for me is what Habermas said, the colonization of the life world. So the capitalist system, the neoliberal, the business world, they can have their logic. That's fine if they follow sort of the money and the power and all this. But the problem is, and that has been, it's not only original for around decades, but the same logic now applies to our livelihoods, to our relationship, how I pick my partner. Like the logic of the neoliberal logic, that's defining how we see others. That's part of the lack of commitment to democracies because it doesn't pay. It doesn't pay off. There's nothing in it for me. The society should sort it out. So that's for me sort of the core, one of the core problems there that we, and the question of power. Thiel is in an enormous position of power. He can make that call. He has all the platforms, all the voices, and I don't agree with Habermas is that we just have to come together and talk. Because we don't come together with the same voice. We come with very different baggage, with very different levels of power. I'm, as a white man in, middle age, I have a lot more than many others. So there's this idea that we just have a sort of a public square, we can just exchange ideas is wrong. It has never worked, but it works now less than ever. Because of those socioeconomic disadvantages and differences and the enormousness of it. It's not just that some the socioeconomic it's just crazy how much power there is monopolized in certain areas. I mean, how can you expect that you can come together and have a decent, open frank conversation and the better argument wins? Sorry, it's yes. Yeah. So it's heated up towards the end.
Thank you very much. That brings an end to our event. Ahmed, on behalf of Conversation at the Crossroads, will now present a small token of appreciation to Mario. And then when you hear this recording, we'll also pass on our token of appreciation to you by mail. And thank you everyone for attending. I hope democracy begins to renew itself in rooms and events like these. So thank you, and let us join with a round of applause for our panelists once again. Thank you. Thank you everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Gracias.